welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Natalie Egleton, CEO of the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, or FRRR, and we're talking about strengthening rural, regional and remote communities. Now, a little bit about Natalie. Natalie Egleton is passionate about facilitating effective responses to issues facing rural communities. She was appointed CEO of the FRRR in November 2015 after joining the organisation in 2012, and she's responsible for shaping FRRR's strategy, designing new programs, and developing and nurturing new funding partnerships. In her previous roles with FRRR, she was responsible for managing natural disaster recovery and preparedness programs, as well as those addressing social innovation. Before joining FRRR, Natalie consulted with Matrix On Board, working with numerous not-for-profit organisations in program evaluation, undertaking research analysis, and developing business plans. She also worked with clients to develop financial policies and procedures, strategic plans, organisation reviews, service mapping, feasibility studies, and governance models. Natalie has also held in-house roles at Evolve or Typo Station and at ANZ Banking Group, implementing projects that made a tangible difference to the lives of people living in rural, regional and remote Australia. She lives in the small rural town of Maldon in central Victoria. Now, I always like to start with where we met. So I first met Natalie when I worked at Australia Post, and I was leading the community response to disasters pretty much a decade ago now. One of the events I attended in the early days was the FRRR's annual conference. Back then, I was one of only a very few number of corporates in the room, and I have to say, what the FRRR does and the passion from its leadership team was definitely a big part of wanting to learn more and do more in the disaster space. So I guess I've known Natalie for nearly a decade now, and it's always really great to catch up and have a conversation with her. Natalie has been a great supporter of me and my corporate to community and other initiatives for, bit over a decade now. Natalie, thanks so much for chatting with me today. It's really great to have you on and share what you're doing at the FRRR. So can I start by asking, what is the FRRR and what impact have you had on communities around rural, regional and remote Australia?
Thanks, Renae. It is excellent to be with you. So the FRRR, the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, is a philanthropic foundation. We're focused on connecting goodwill with good purpose to strengthen the vitality of remote, rural and regional Australia. So we do that primarily by providing grant funding. We also broker partnerships and resources between communities and funders. And we develop and share insights and learning from communities to inform policymakers and funding bodies of the needs and importantly, the solutions that are available in response to a lot of the challenges being experienced by remote, rural and regional communities. So we've been in operation for 21 years now. And in that time, we've distributed over $115 million to around 12,000 projects across the country. Yeah, so it's growing. And that, there's just so much impact in all of those 12,000 initiatives over that period of time. And they all tend to have ripple effects and they're typically reasonably small amounts of money provided into initiatives that benefit multiple parts of the community and really work to strengthen the resilience of those communities. So they're quite diverse. They're all community-led and they all share an underlying outcome about strengthening the resilience and strengthening the capacity of communities to seed ideas and to adapt and evolve with change. And to innovate and renew for their futures.
As I said in the intro for this episode, Natalie, I mean, I've known FRRR for over a decade and, I often say it's the small things that make the biggest difference. And I have not been into a regional community that hasn't had some connection with the FRRR or a grant program or some, change opportunity. So again, those small things, particularly in those regional and rural communities, can make the biggest difference. And it's such a great initiative and program and outcomes that you deliver to. So in your, the overview of the FRRR, you say that you're focused on grant making, enabling and influencing. So why are each of those needed or important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess for FRRR, our vision is for a vibrant, resilient and revitalised remote, rural and regional Australia. And we think achieving that vision requires a multifaceted and a deeply collaborative approach. So we've developed a model of philanthropy and a strategy that deploys resources against those three kind of capabilities. So I can go into them each a little bit if you like.
Yeah, please.
So firstly, grants they're a great tool for supporting the activation of community plans and ideas, or filling gaps that exist in communities. But I guess the money is the tool that enables a lot of things to happen, but the grant is it's an activator of sorts. So I guess we think about our role in offering those resources as being that sort of activation tool. So we know that in smaller and more remote communities in particular, grassroots organisations and community groups that are typically volunteer run or pretty small and community based can experience barriers to accessing funding that's really suited to their needs and their scale. So our grants are really about responding to that inequity of opportunities and access to funding, but also facilitating action and activation of initiatives from the ground up within communities that build those broad outcomes that I mentioned before. So that's kind of the granting side. The second part around the leveraging or enabling, as you described it, is that FRRR, I always call this the boring but important part of FRRR, has a special listing in the Tax Act as a DGR1 charity.
Okay, yeah, on board. Tax Act, no more.
I know, so I go into that. But essentially that DGR listing enables FRRR to work across all of the charitable categories, so from health, wellbeing, education, environment, including economic development. But it also enables us specifically to broker partnerships between funders and communities, which is primarily done through community foundation partnerships and other place-based not-for-profit organisations that don't have DGR1 status. So FRRR can actually leverage funding and broker funding by using our DGR1 status and offer donors the tax deductibility and provide a commitment to those donors that we will provide those funds to our partners within those community foundations or place-based organisations. So it's about really brokering more resourcing and more funding that would otherwise not be accessible by those organisations. So it's a really an enabling role, and one that we can play a strategic linkage piece in. Creates efficiencies, creates confidence for donors, makes it more profile and awareness of those organisations that are otherwise reasonably invisible to the donor community, and obviously gets more money into their hands to do great work. And so the third part of the model is the insights and learning, which is really about recognising that the projects that we're supporting and those partnerships and relationships that we broker and facilitate, there's absolute gold in that in terms of what it says about the solutions that exist within rural communities to some of our, quite macro challenges. If we think about climate change and climate solutions, or if we think about equitable access to services in remote areas, or if we think about disaster resilience and preparedness, we know that through all of those 12,000 projects we've supported, there's deep knowledge and wisdom that's come from the ground up in communities, that comes from lived experience, that comes from testing, piloting, seeding, and kind of expanding and scaling initiatives. And so we've got a role as a national organisation that sort of straddles the sectors of philanthropy, government, business and community and not-for-profits to harness the insights that come from all of that work and use that to share back up the line to policymakers or to those wanting to fund and invest in regional communities, and I guess provide guidance on what works well, as well as what the challenges are and what some of the areas that need attention are.
To me, FRRR has always been that kind of well-rounded and real advocate and supporter of regional and rural and remote communities. And I think, even outside of the disaster space, you've got so many programs to strengthen and build social capital, etc. So why is the FRRR different to other not-for-profits in the disaster space?
It's a really busy space, isn't it? There's a lot of
these
organisations.
days.
Yeah, there's just and every time we have a major disaster, it seems to have that kind of period of time where there is, a significant amount of interest and energy, and then it kind of settles back down again. And I think we're in that space at the moment where there's a heightened interest following the Black Summer bushfires in particular and the floods in New South Wales. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to kind of understand how to work effectively in a coordinated way. So to your question, I think that's FRRR's difference, is that FRRR is actually structured, constituted to be a coordinating mechanism and to reduce some of the complexity and some of the challenges for communities in accessing philanthropic funding. So essentially, FRRR acts as a trusted partner with communities, and we've always, got our ear to the ground. I think importantly, we're always there, regardless of whether there's a disaster or not. And that's one of the, you just mentioned that we do a lot of other programs that are nothing to do with disasters, but it means that when something does happen, we've already got some engagement or some relationships and, activity that we've probably been doing. So that sort of means that there's just a confidence and a continuity, and we've got structures and processes that are easy to sort of scale up or down. But the other side of that is that our model is really really focused on enabling funders to give with confidence and know where their money's going and know that it's going to the right places. So we sort of act as a bit of a backbone for those wanting to give during disasters in a different way to the likes of the Red Cross or others who are playing a more direct role. Ours is about getting the money and the funding to local community groups and local community organisations and local community leaders so that they can actually be in charge of the recovery or in charge of their preparedness efforts to a greater degree. I was just going to say that I guess the focus of the work is also about strengthening community level resilience. And so from that perspective, we work through what we think of as a cycle of development, which includes periodic shocks such as natural disasters. So we kind of approach our work from the perspective of communities always going through cycles. And in any given year, most rural communities will be in either a recovery from a natural disaster or experiencing a disaster like a prolonged drought, or they will be getting ready for the next one. And so there's always a cycle going on there, but there are other influences and shocks and stresses that are also playing a part in that community's context, which, we need to be tuned into as well and make sure that what we're providing support for is relevant to that context and that place.
I've known the FRRR for a long time now, and again, you mentioned before that it's you work from that ground up, and I think that's so important. And obviously, in the disaster space with the community-led recovery and resilience, it's always it's great to say, but then there needs to be ways to enable communities to do that. So the grants programs that you run are so great because it again enables the small things to have big impacts, but also the communities to to the extent of what they can and the capabilities that they have to kind of evolve their capabilities and skills and focus on what's important to them and, build that resilience as well as recovery, which I think I've seen and noticed that FRRR's kind of evolved into the resilience space again, a bit like me, sort of a few years before the word became the buzzword. But, I think you mentioned the fact that FRRR is known in the communities. And so why is the FRRR like so important to those communities? So from the community side.
And I think rural communities need champions and they need advocates. They need their voices to be amplified to the audiences that matter. And it's not that they can't do it themselves, because they absolutely can. So it's more about, walking alongside them and being that champion and not speaking for them or on behalf of them, but hearing what they say and relaying that. And I guess the reality is that all rural, remote and regional communities are experiencing increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters. We know that. We know that there are climate change impacts that are leading to really extreme weather events in greater frequency. And it's also true, as I mentioned earlier, that there's inequity in the levels of funding that is directed to communities. And particularly, when we think about funding and donations directed to communities impacted by disasters, there's great inequity. There was very little funding, contributed after the New South Wales floods. The current experience of the storms in Victoria, there's been very little attention and very little funding, but the impacts are terrible. So they need organisations like FRRR who are going to be there no matter what, and who will be, working alongside them regardless of how much public attention.
And again, the trust that the FRRR has in the communities, you're there for the good times and the bad times too. And you can't buy that and you can't beat that. So it's such an important organisation for the communities in many ways who need it the most. Now, what kind of change, or I guess, what's the future evolution? And you've just had a new branding, a rebranding, which I love. It's
Mm.
a great fresh look and approach, because your old branding was there pretty much since the day I first connected with the organisation. So it's a beautiful, refreshed branding and approach. So what kind of change is FRRR aiming to drive in the disaster and the resilience space moving forward? Is there something that you're kind of evolving to do or achieve or deliver?
Mm. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for noticing the branding. The original branding had been there since the organisation's establishment. So
Yeah.
20 years that logo hung around. So
Yeah,
well and
about
truly
time.
had its time. And we too, yeah, we think the new look and feel is just fresh and forward looking and contemporary and all the things that rural Australia is. So in terms of our, future directions, we remain committed to all of the principles we've always worked on, which is, that community-led practice, working with really serious authenticity and integrity, and working at the pace that communities are interested in and willing to work at, and bolstering, their efforts in the best ways we can. When it comes to the disaster recovery and resilience space, we're still really committed to the value of the medium to long-term recovery, and we think that that's critical. And we've been really pleased to see some, shifting around the recognition of the true, timescale of recovery, and the true appreciation of, it being really a lifelong experience, not just a 2-3 year rebuild and move on experience. So, we will continue to work in that space, and continue to provide funding that is targeted to that medium to long-term recovery, which, has an underlying principle about the longer-term change and evolution that happens through recovery as well. But on the other side is an increased focus on preparedness, and really trying to foster and build up the authorisation of community-led preparedness processes, and linking those community-led processes into the formal emergency management system, and really giving it authority and validation. So we've been doing some really promising work in New South Wales over the last few years, and are kind of getting started on some in Victoria. And we've been supporting the communities after the 2009 bushfires, since then as well. And there's some really good evidence emerging, from that work over that long period of time, about effectiveness of allowing those community-led processes to be formalised, and what that means when a disaster does happen, in terms of the ability for that community to respond well, and activate and mobilise the systems effectively, and recover better.
Yeah, and I guess, the whole preparedness and resilience, from a preparedness perspective, is, it's vital. So the findings in that, no doubt, it will be, yeah, super interesting to kind of see, because I think that's almost what's missing in many ways. Although there's lots of, documents and reporting to say that $1 invested before saves $14 after, but I think it's more than just the money. It's the, lives and livelihoods, and just, environmental impacts, etc. So having
Mm.
more evidence-based around supporting the preparedness can only be a good and a beneficial thing. So can I ask you, we've mentioned about how you sort of act as a bit of a conduit, I guess, for philanthropic funders, et cetera, and that, but you also work, and me, my whole passion is the business sector or business community. So you obviously work with corporates and private sector as well. How does FRRR work with the private sector?
Yeah, we have a range of different partnership approaches, I suppose. We really appreciate that the business sector is not homogenous, and so everything from the small businesses, SMEs, through to the major large corporates, all have different needs, different interests, different stakeholders, different employee bases. So it's about trying to work out what's right for them, and if they've got an interest in providing funding or volunteer support or skilled support or whatever it is into regional communities, our approach starts with, okay, so what would that look like for you, and what are the tangible things you're looking for, and how does that link with your strategy, and then what do we have in existence that might actually align really well with that we could enable. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to drop names here, but I'll I'll mention a couple if that's all right.
Sure.
So an example was, we'd been speaking with the Kellogg's Foundation for a while, and they had just refined their strategy. It wasn't specifically around disasters; it was around food security, which we know is a big issue in disaster settings anyway.
Yep.
And we had a few conversations where we sort of got to know each other's strategies, and discovered that actually we've got a program that they could fund into, and that could leverage their funding quite substantially. So that was one mechanism. In other cases, we design bespoke programs with corporates. So we've had a number over the years. The longest running was the ANZ Seeds of Renewal program, which is, I shouldn't say was, because it's still running. That's been going for 20 years. We run that as a fully branded grant program that we administer. We do all of the community outreach and engagement, and ANZ contribute obviously the funding, but also their branch network, and really get the word out there, and it enables a great connection for their staff within the communities they're working in, and opportunities for them to really feel connected to the company, but also know that their giving is being done well.
Yeah, from the corporate side too, and having been at Australia Post and also consulting into corporates. I mean, I've mentioned, we've talked about this a lot in advance. There's so much that corporates can do, and it's obviously money, but more than money as well. I think the skill sets and the capabilities that corporates have, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of internal understanding as to the benefits it can provide, but I think there's a long way to go for, corporates to really evolve. So organizations like Kellogg's or ANZ, et cetera, who recognize and want to collaborate to create an outcome that delivers is, it's the way to go. And there's benefit, obviously, for the corporate side of the fence as well as the communities. Now, we both started doing a bit of work under the public-private partnerships network, I guess it was back then, just after the bushfires. I mean, we very quickly put together some working groups and in Melbourne and Sydney and whatnot, between government, private and philanthropic, which, had really great feedback. Do you see that there's an opportunity for more of those kinds of things going forward, about bringing, the key stakeholder groups together to collaborate on shared outcomes?
Yeah, I think, and it was really great to work with you on getting that up and running so quickly after the fires, and it's great to see that it's endured for this long. I think it is, it's important from a principal's perspective that those working to support communities in their recovery should be coordinated as much as they can be, in order to reduce burden on those communities and ensure that what is being provided is done in a way that is, as seamless as possible, as informed as possible, and clearly as collaborative as possible. It's easier said than done to actually get traction and get outcomes. And when you've got so many jurisdictions and in such a chaotic space in terms of, the early relief and recovery, and just, so particularly the Black Summer fires, where there was just such widespread impact, it's a complex, but I think it's better to at least try and to stay at the table than to not in the first instance. I think in terms of the outcomes, though, the really important thing is to find the points in the system where coordination is possible. And I think that's what we could do better going forward, and we haven't quite mastered. I think one of the challenges is all of the different organisations are putting together their programs and their initiatives, and they're scheduling them, and then they put them out, and we haven't actually consulted each other about how we could have done that in a more seamless way. So you end up with communities being overwhelmed by multiple funding opportunities coming at them at once, with deadlines that are very close, and, not much resourcing to attend to it all. So that's, I think, something I would really love to see being done better. We're giving it a crack in the south coast of New South Wales at a very sort of initial level with a group of funders. So I think, it's probably easier done on a more localised level than it is on a national level. And, it's probably an opportunity for organisations like ours and like this network to sort of pilot some ways of doing that. But the coordination piece is critical. Whether we can truly collaborate is potentially a different question, but certainly if we're thinking about the collaboration spectrum, coordination is where we can easily start and at least share information more effectively and make the access to information easier for people in communities too.
Yeah, correct. And we've obviously won some grant programs under the federal and state FRRR fund, and all we hear from New South Wales at the moment is it's gone from grant writing fatigue to grant program delivery overwhelm. There seems to be too much money being given out for the, ability to comprehend what it is and then find the project managers to deliver it. And it's kind of gone from one problem to the other, which hopefully will have, wonderful outcomes. But also there's a finite time for it all to be delivered. And it's, grant upon grant upon grant upon grant, which is, a bit of a challenge. So that's a great initiative. And as we talk about often, there are little kind of, I guess, gaps in the process or consequences that might necessarily have been considered in the process that, the likes of FRRR, and I know at C2C, that's what we try to do too, is sort of fill the gaps to make the outcome as best as possible. Now, you might have just answered one of these, but I also finish up with the same question. So what would be the 2 things that you'd like to be done differently in the disaster space? Only 2, Natalie.
Yeah. Only 2. Look, I think I did just answer some of it, the coordination piece. And I know the new national agency is very committed to this coordination piece, but it has to be, heavily informed by the local level and, the lived experience. So that's one piece that I think we may never get 100% right, but if there's good intention around it, it will help. One of the other things is probably the continued challenge around timing of funding, and it's linked to the challenge and the dynamic of pressure to get money out the door quickly and make things happen, and the clear need for there to be support provided to communities with the reality, and you've just described it in terms of that overwhelm and that overload. The reality of how long this stuff actually takes, and finding ways to actually map the system so that we understand which bits should be put in early and which bits should actually be more patient and long term, and not rushing communities to do projects within 12 months. If it's going to take 3 years, let's let it take 3 years. So I think there's a big piece about that sort of funding system that I would love to see change, and we're certainly doing our bit to inform.
Yeah, agree. And I think the timing's really interesting too, because again, as we've spoken about quite often, is, every community is different, and then, every community goes at its own pace, and it's had different impacts, but it's also having a different response in the recovery, or even in, the preparedness or resilience building as well. So no 2 communities are the same. So to put them all in a kind of pot of money that if they don't apply for it, they miss out. But then if they do apply for it, they're not necessarily ready to actually activate it. So it's, it's part of, I guess, the bigger kind of process. And again, there's a few things we could kind of work on to evolve. But Natalie, thanks so much for your time. In this episode, I've been talking with Natalie Egleton, the CEO of the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, or the FRRR, and we've been talking about strengthening rural, regional and remote communities. Natalie, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, and remember, we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.